Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar sponsored by SS&C and Drawbridge on a few topics really important to the alternative investment management space. We're going to talk about AI, as Tina mentioned. We're going to talk about how you evaluate your critically important vendors and systematic intermediaries in their readiness against cyber threats. And we'll talk about the importance of humans in building proper cyber defenses. As Tina mentioned, Spencer is from SS&C. He's the Director of Strategy and Operations, where he advises senior management on product and client strategy. He joined SS&C via GlobeUp, and prior to that, he worked in private banking and the U.S. Navy. I think everybody knows who SS&C is, one of the world's largest independent hedge fund and private equity administrators and mutual fund transfer agency. Simon Eyre is Drawbridge's CISO. He wakes up every day and makes sure that he keeps Drawbridge and our client data safe from any outside threats. He also acts as a virtual CISO to our clients, to our prospects, and to the broad world of influencers in the alts space. Drawbridge is a leading provider of cyber programs in the alts space with over 1,000 clients. We also track, we're going to talk about vendors, we also track about 4,000 vendors. Let's jump into it. First question, let's start with, because we've got a really large and important alt space intermediary, SS&C, with us today. Let's start with the first question. Part one to Simon, part two to Spencer. Why is it important, Simon, to evaluate vendors in general, regardless of size? Thing one. Thing two, to Spencer, a lot of people on the phone today who are small to medium-sized managers wake up and ask themselves, I should assume that SS&C has a really strong cyber posture. Why should I evaluate a large and important vendor? Why is that important? Simon, over to you.
Yeah, so I think from the first standpoint, why? Well, certainly if you look at, there's a variety of studies out there. Outsourcing your business functions is mainstream now, depending on the area you're looking at, whether it's fund admin, IT, so your MSP, human resources, it could be a variety of things. Studies are showing that these departments in the hedge space, the uptake is somewhere between 70 and 98% of funds that are actually outsourcing some of these critical functions. And so the prevalence of it is so incredibly important. If you're taking business functions outside, you still have to apply the same security that you would have had if you insourced it. And that's coming from investors, the LPs, it's coming from regulators. They're setting these standards. And so even if you're working with a large firm, you need to ensure and establish that the cybersecurity expectations that you have, that the regulators have, are being met at the vendors too. Certain industries, for example, may be agnostic to the type of business that you are, and therefore won't have necessarily baked in the cyber controls that they need, that you require. So it's important to do those risk assessments to really understand where their baseline and their standards are. Even with larger vendors, many of the solutions that you may be getting out of the box may not necessarily have the right technical controls. Data may not necessarily be retained for the amount of time that you need. So it's important to evaluate those and understand that. It goes beyond just traditional cybersecurity risks as well. We're seeing this more in the language used by the SEC in their exam priorities for next year. We see it with DORA, that level of operational resilience too. You need to understand and assess how the exporting this, the sending out of those business functions, the outsourcing of those business functions could affect your business if you have an outage, if you have a lack of availability of that system for some reason. So there's really important layers here as to why you really need to assess even the largest of vendors and their impact on your firm.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good segue to like, how does it apply in real life and even, to us at SS&C. But I would second everything Simon said that, even established vendors benefit from outside scrutiny. It really doesn't matter how reputable you think a firm is. That trust that you should have in the firm should come from ongoing verification rather than just having basing it on assumptions. And I don't think we're immune to that, and I kind of welcome that opportunity to earn that trust, because I don't think in today's environment you can just rely on reputation alone. And that's, our business in particular as a fund administrator is especially exposed to that because our entire business is built on the trust and confidence our clients have on that NAV stamp the SS&C stamp that we put on those month-end statements. And we're basically nothing without it. And I think there are some great examples of recent over the last couple of years of very large firms being exposed to bad actors, and ones that you would assume, not assume, but you'd think that they'd have all these things figured out. But their vendor exposure at Microsoft, at Cisco, at the Department of Defense, through like the SolarWinds breach a couple of years ago, that I think pierces that veil of invincibility of even the largest vendors, and kind of welcomes then the opportunity to ensure that you're putting the controls in place to ensure that you don't have overexposure to singular vendors, but also that as many of the controls that are possible in place do exist. And I think even earlier this year, Change Health, healthcare had the ransomware attack. One of the largest firms in the United States, if not the world, due to lack of multi-factor authorization, something seemingly simple that we take for granted that we have to use to get into our own PayPal accounts. Led to exposure of tens of thousands of people that affected their daily lives, and then it ended up costing $22 million in a ransomware payment. So yeah, and I think that was a good segue, Bill, even talking about like, why would smaller firms care about this, or why should they not question, but like do their due diligence? I would just give the example that I've been in some of these conversations with some of our largest, most sophisticated hedge clients. They're some of the most largest, most sophisticated firms in the world, and they do deep on-site due diligence with us and our firms ongoing, before they sign up, and then on a regular basis. And it's something that keeps us on our toes and ensures everyone is accountable to everybody else. And I think it's no secret that some of those most successful firms are the most guarded, the most secretive, and the most secure. And that's a trait that I think we should all try to emulate as we try to match that and exceed their success. So I guess the final thing is, it's just not static. It's continually earned, continually validated. And I think if you go through that, you'll trust your vendors even more, and you'll hopefully SSC proves that we are in the best place to be providing that trust and assurance.
I think that's a really good point. So it is not static. Software changes, data footprints change, and therefore the cyber conversation has to be ongoing and dynamic. Second question, part one to Simon, part two back to you, Spencer. The human element in effective cyber defenses is critical. Most studies and insurance data show that the vast majority of breaches are directly related to a human vulnerability. Part one for Simon. What are the key areas that need attention to ensure the human judgment and behavior are cyber assets, not liabilities, to a manager's cyber program? Part two for Spencer. How does a company like SS&C, with 27,000 staff globally in multiple lines of business, from GlobeOp to Porsche, you name it, how do they get the human element right to protect client data and operations? Simon.
Yeah, well, Bill, you're absolutely right that the vast majority still have that human element. And again, there's statistics here that put more than 3/4 of all breaches have that human element. For an asset manager, it can come in one of a couple of different ways. The primary method, and certainly all the breaches that we learn about tend to happen through some sort of communication-based attack. So we're still looking, even at this day and age, we're still looking at phishing attacks. It is perhaps less about the opportunistic sending of junk mail with links that people will click on, and they're becoming a little bit more finely tuned these days with impersonation style attacks. And the introduction of free, easy to use generative AI has certainly seen the improvements, if that's the right word, in the quality of the messaging and the style of writing. We very often, for years and years and years, have said a red flag is typos and grammatical errors and things like that. Not necessarily something that's as easily picked up upon these days. Certainly, the language choice and the type of content has improved dramatically. We also see a great number of really targeted types of attacks in communications as well. So information being scraped from public news releases, so press releases, LinkedIn, this type of thing, all of that information being used. We see that in private equity and portcos, new investments, impersonating each other, trying to establish some sort of communication method. We see that. We see new people joining companies and executives being impersonated and writing to them at their corporate message, their corporate mail, email addresses. So there's a variety of things that are happening, and it's all down to the human to really collect and understand and identify these types of things. So awareness is so critical here. We try to encourage the use of training throughout the year. Doing just a one-time 30-minute session annually really has a large drop-off in awareness later on in the year. So introducing things like phishing testing, for example, just micro notifications on the latest risk alerts that are happening that may get put out by people like us, like Drawbridge or the SEC or the NFA. All of these organizations are pretty active in trying to improve awareness. So there's a lot of things that can be done here to really help build up and attract your attention. Then there's the other aspect to this as well, that as people are rolling out technologies, the human element could be something on a technical standpoint, misconfigurations of cloud services, not leaving default passwords in place on certain systems, these sort of things. So it's not always about the unfortunate person that gets that message and clicks a link. It's also about governing the rollout of technologies and software solutions too.
Yeah, I think the segue to SS&C and 27,000 people, I think is interesting because especially building off the previous question on how size gives us strength, gives us scale. 20,000 people also means we have 27,000 different threat vectors that come to hit us, 27,000 liabilities, and but also 27,000 points for the first line of defense and against those vulnerabilities. So for us, like any large organization, you have to do and put the controls in place, put the training, education tailored to every domicile that we touch, that ensures that we cannot fail at any one time dealing with those 27,000 people. So it is a monumental task, but I think it's just a reality of our business, and I think it's something that if you're very good at, just makes you stronger. I think we are pretty good at that. But the training piece, I think, is underappreciated, especially or like the importance of that is underappreciated, because especially in this age of AI, and I'm thinking about like threats that firms now are exposed to by just these tools existing is not fully understood or fully appreciated. You have some examples of some very high profile firms have shut down access, just blanket, because it's too much of a risk. And I think one of the ones I welcome everyone to kind of look up after this is the Samsung case from over a year ago now. But they had engineers expose sensitive proprietary code to ChatGPT in order to help with QA and do some code optimization and a couple different aspects of their business, and without fully understanding what that meant for their intellectual property and how an LLM and how uses data that's entered into those prompts, and how ChatGPT improves that model over time by training on that data. And there's some, if you understand how these models work, or you just start to become more familiar with the fact that they learn almost like our brain does, and they don't actually know where that data came from, and if they were to provide an answer. And so when that model was exposed to that proprietary data, they did notice that later, when asking for prompts unrelated to what they were working on in a different chat, they were actually getting that proprietary code back, which means that code is gone and there's no way to claw it back. And I think if I'd also welcome people to check out the lawsuits that are going through the courts now with New York Times, and now I think just recently a consortium of Canadian publishers recently sued OpenAI regarding the use of their proprietary data, which is all of their all their intellectual property, all their source code, their articles that have been used to train all these different models. And if you read some of those things back from OpenAI and those lawsuits, you'll get some exposure to like what they can or cannot do. They cannot tell you what they even trained on. They can't extract that from the model. Once it's gone, it's gone. So it'll be interesting to see that work its way through the courts. But I don't think anybody on this call wants to be setting precedent in court on with the defensibility of their IP that was exposed to an LLM. And I would even caution folks, like if you have a agreement in place, a corporate B2B agreement with any of the providers, like even OpenAI, the leader in the field, and they say that they will not train your data on their data, just know that if they make a mistake and it trains, there's no way, there's like no recourse to pull that back. There's no ability to undo that, at least as it exists now. So I just caution people, because it's a powerful tool. People who want to stay ahead in their industry and their field are going to need to use these tools to maintain their level of efficiency, maintain their competitiveness, and they're going to be like, your high achiever is going to be drawn to them. And you just need to ensure that your firm and your people understand the risks of those tools, having the controls in place, and ensure that they are, everyone on your team understands like how to properly use them. Because I think the dangers are currently underappreciated, but we'll see it play out as more case law comes out on exactly what the implications are. But again, you don't want to be the leading indicator there. The unintended exposure. And if you look up that case, I think it would be worth just putting yourself in the shoes of how you might be exposed to that and how you would have dealt with your own intellectual property being exposed to one of those models. But
thank you. Follow-up question actually on all things AI. Question for Spencer first, and then Simon. Speaking of AI, what are some of the key strategies to protect both the models that are being built and the data, whether that data is public data or proprietary data or commingled? What are the best strategies to protect the use of that information in any AI model or machine learning capability?
Right. I think it's a good segue from the previous question. I still think it's education. I still think it's the people. People need to know how to use these tools. Going forward, you're not going to remove every possible threat vector. You're not going to remove every single entry point that's something, or exit point for your data. if people are going to be able to do their jobs. So you have to start with the education piece. Yeah, and that means a good governance policy and one that's enforceable. And so I'll say, at least for us, the same people who do, the internal audit folks who ensure that, we make our SOC 1 and SOC 2 requirements and complete our annual audit, are the same people that are reviewing our AI governance policy, which had the opportunity to, join that group as a plank owner and come up with some of these things. But even the technical expertise to understand how the models work is a whole different ballgame from the governance piece of how to actually put together the controls that ensure compliance with that governance model. So it starts with that education piece, like right off the bat. And then I think there's, well, how can you use those tools more safely? Like, do you need to put up the guardrails? For us in our business, it's in the way that our business is built on trust and sensitive client data. It's the core of our value proposition. We've decided that we're taking those models offline. Now you can use the model safely online, but we've kind of decided that the controls in place, the recourse that it currently exists in the system for using these public models, even ones that are offered through cloud providers like AWS, through Bedrock, are just not, there's not enough in there to make us feel comfortable. So we're hosting them internally, standing up our own GPUs, using some open source models, lots of controls and lots of testing, but we're ensuring that there's an audit trail for every prompt that's ever submitted to the system, and that we have different controls in place that allow for controls for prompt injection, attack detection, automatic PII redaction, and hallucination detection as like the first three. So that anyone who wants to use an AI model internally or builds it into their systems, like they're going through our governance controlled, guardrail provided AI system that has no exposure to a public outside model. And we found that's, the tuning a llama model achieves, on par or better with less memory usage than some of the leading, publicly provided models. So it starts with that education piece, but you do, not to say that you can't, but that you can ignore the technical aspects of it, but building those guardrails around it and ensuring that you have the audit trail in place is extremely important. Once you educate everyone on the risks.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing Spencer's details and of how they've adjusted kind of their cyber framework, if you will, to accommodate AI. One of the more sort of the initial challenges with AI is when you have your traditional sort of classical data security models, where you map out how data flows within the business, which system is doing the processing, where it is stored, how it's transmitted. AI really throws additional, almost less finite, less dead, less fixed areas of processing, and whether that data remains stored or if it's been used for learning, is the inference of that data's existence still within the model? How can you identify that data has been used because you ask similar questions and suddenly you get a spike in the confidence rating or something like that? So there's a lot of additional things and thoughts to the standard data flow mapping. Classification of data as well is changing. So you may have had traditional, public, internal, confidential type categories. There are more layers to it now. That the European AI Act has a good example of the different layers and justifying sort of certain levels of controls around it. So there's a lot happening and changing right now still on how you're going to do the best way to protect your data. Even the SEC, for example, it's 2025 exam priorities mention AI, they talk about it, but they are in a sort of data collecting phase at the moment. They want to know how funds are using it, how vendors are going to be using it. What will be the potential impact of introducing AI technologies within the environment? Are they doing it from a software and processing and forecasting level? Are they using it for generative reasons? So there's still a lot going on there to see how this will all pan out. But the protection mechanisms, there are still traditional ways that need to be thought of. Data minimization. With AI, there is a kind of an almost inherent thought that you just chuck everything at it and just let it see what it can come out with. But there's still, from a business perspective, you want to minimize just flooding it with information. Not only do you risk the integrity and the correctness and the confidence of that data in terms of an output, but you may be giving it things that it shouldn't necessarily be learning about. Good perimeter security. We're sort of back to the days of ensuring that there are correct controls on the access to those models and the fields, the permissions on data as well. Are you potentially, opening up doors, whereas on a network, for example, we may have very fixed permissions as to who can access certain drives. But if you put that data into a model that can then be queried, have you blurred the lines between permissions and who can access certain types of data? So there's a lot of things to be considered here, but and again, still you can make use of some of those traditional cybersecurity structures as well to help you.
That's great. Well, thank you both for attending, Simon and Spencer, and thanks to our audience for listening.